A hardened spirit bought a girl branded too wild for any decent man, not to break her will, but because in her shattered gaze, he recognized the echo of his own desolate soul, wondering if two broken things, side by side, could somehow make a whole. The sun beat down on Redemption Gulch with the merciless judgment of a preacher condemning a sinner, each ray a fiery accusation. Dust, fine as powdered bone, coated everything, the clapboard storefronts, the rutted track that served as Main Street, and the weary souls who called this harsh frontier outpost home. In the center of this sweltering stage, beneath the leering gaze of a gathered crowd, stood Ilara. Her dress, once perhaps a faded calico, was now a testament to hardship, torn and stained, clinging to a frame made thin by more than just hunger. Her hair, the color of storm clouds, was a tangled halo around a face smudged with dirt and despair, yet in the depths of her downcast eyes, a spark of untamed defiance still flickered, a tiny ember refusing to be extinguished. Jedediah Thorne, a man whose girth strained the buttons of his grimy waistcoat and whose breath reeked of cheap whiskey and malice, held the frayed end of a rope loosely tied about Ilara's wrist. "Step right up, gentlemen," Thorne boomed, his voice a gravelly affront to the tense silence. "Got a special one here today. Calls herself Ilara, though Wildcat suits her better. A bit rough around the edges, they say she's cursed, touched in the head, too wild for civil folk, but strong-backed for work, if you've got the stomach to tame her. What am I bid for this spirited piece?" His laughter was a wet, unpleasant sound, met by a smattering of jeers and coarse remarks from the assembled men. Women clutched their children tighter, their faces a mixture of pity and fear, whispering about the girl's misfortune, her supposed madness, the ill luck she carried. Ilara flinched at each shouted bid, each cruel assessment of her worth, her body held rigid against the tide of humiliation. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in years. Tears were a luxury she couldn't afford, a weakness she wouldn't show. She was a thing to be bartered, a burden to be shifted, her future a bleak, unwritten page in someone else's cruel ledger. The dust swirled around her worn boots, a mockery of the life that had been stolen from her, piece by painful piece, until only this public degradation remained. The hammer of the sun, the weight of 100 condemning eyes, the raw wound of her spirit exposed, this was Redemption Gulch, and for Ilara, redemption seemed a bitter, unattainable dream. She was adrift in a sea of hard faces, each one reflecting her own desolation back at her, a captive audience to her slow unraveling. On the edge of the jeering throng, leaning against a sun-bleached support post of the general store, stood Silas. He was a man carved from the unforgiving landscape itself, all lean lines and weathered resilience. His face, shadowed by the brim of a battered hat, was a map of past sorrows, etched by sun and solitude. A slight, almost imperceptible limp in his right leg spoke of old battles, of pain long endured. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were fixed on Ilara, missing nothing of her quiet defiance, her carefully concealed terror. He'd seen auctions like this before, remnants of a brutality he thought he'd left behind in the war-torn East. He'd come west seeking peace, a place where a man could outrun his ghosts, but the ugliness of the world had a long reach. Thorne's voice grated on him, each boastful word a fresh insult to the girl's dignity. Silas felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the echo of past helplessness, of moments when he'd been unable to intervene, to protect. He shifted his weight, the old ache in his leg a dull throb. He was a solitary man, his ranch his only confidant, his words few and far between. Yet, as he watched Ilara, standing small and straight amidst the mockery, something in her unbroken spirit called to the fractured pieces of his own. He saw not the wildcat Thorne described, but a flicker of the same stubborn will to survive that kept him putting one foot in front of the other, day after desolate day. He pushed himself off the post, the decision settling in him quiet and firm as bedrock. He moved through the crowd, his silence parting the onlookers more effectively than any shout. They quieted as he approached, their curiosity piqued by this ghost of a man who rarely came to town, and never for sport. Thorne, momentarily silenced by Silas's unexpected presence, squinted. "Well now, Silas Blackwood. Didn't figure you for this kind of entertainment." Silas ignored him, his gaze still on Ilara. He reached into his worn leather pouch, his movements deliberate. $50, he said, his voice raspy from disuse, but carrying a weight that cut through the renewed murmurs of the crowd. A hush fell. $50 was a steep price, more than anyone expected, especially from a man known for his frugality. Thorne's eyes widened, then narrowed with avarice. 50? For this half-wild thing? She's got spirit, I'll grant YA, might take some brayek in. Silas's eyes, cold as river stones, met Thorne's. My price. Take it or leave it. There was no menace in his tone, just an unyielding finality. Thorne, seeing no higher bidders and eager for the coin, grumbled but nodded. Sold, then. To the silent Mr. Blackwood. Don't come crying to me when she bites. Silas counted out the coins into Thorne's grimy palm, then his gaze shifted to the rope on Ilara's wrist. He didn't reach for it. He simply looked at it, then at her. Ilara stared back, her expression unreadable, a maelstrom of fear, confusion, and a desperate, unwilling flicker of something akin to bewilderment. She was still a prisoner, just one with a new, silent jailer. The journey to Silas's ranch was a long, wordless passage through a landscape that mirrored the desolation in Ilara's heart. The trail wound upwards, away from Redemption Gulch, into foothills covered in scrub oak and stubborn pines. Dust rose in plumes behind Silas's aging mare, settling like a shroud on Ilara as she walked beside his horse, untethered now but bound by an invisible chain of uncertainty. Silas had offered her a place on the horse, a gruff, almost inaudible mumble, but she'd shaken her head, preferring the solid ground beneath her feet, the illusion of control it offered. He hadn't pressed. Hours passed under the vast, indifferent sky. The silence between them was thick, broken only by the plod of hooves, the creak of saddle leather, and the whisper of the wind through the dry grass. Ilara watched Silas's back, searching for clues in the set of his shoulders, the angle of his hat, but he remained an enigma, a man of shadows and silence. As dusk began to paint the sky in hues of bruised purple and faded orange, they crested a ridge. Below them lay a small, secluded valley. In its heart, nestled beside a thin ribbon of a creek, was Silas's ranch. It was a humble affair, a small, sturdy cabin of rough-hewn logs, a lean-to barn, and a few weathered corrals. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, a lonely sentinel in the growing twilight. There was an air of neglect about the place, yet also a sense of endurance, of something that had weathered many storms. Ilara's heart, a tight knot of apprehension, sank a little further. It was isolated, remote, a place where screams would go unheard. Silas dismounted, his movements stiff. He led the mare towards the barn, leaving Ilara standing uncertainly by the cabin. When he returned, he gestured towards the door. Inside, his voice was flat, devoid of emotion. The cabin was sparse but surprisingly clean. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a rough table and 2 chairs its main furnishings. A narrow door led to what she assumed was his sleeping quarters. He pointed to a small alcove, curtained off with a faded blanket. There. You can sleep there. Inside the alcove was a narrow cot with a thin mattress and a neatly folded wool blanket. A small, cracked pitcher and basin sat on an upturned crate. It was more than she'd had in a long time, yet the fear remained, a cold serpent coiling in her belly. He prepared a simple meal of beans and dried meat, ladling a portion onto a tin plate for her. They ate in silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound. Ilara ate slowly, cautiously, expecting a demand, a price for the food and shelter. None came. When they were done, Silas simply took the plates, rinsed them, and sat by the fire, sharpening a knife, his gaze distant. Ilara retreated to her alcove, pulling the blanket tight around her, every muscle tensed, waiting. But all she heard was the sigh of the wind outside, and the quiet rhythm of Silas's breathing from the other side of the cabin. Sleep was a long time coming, a restless, shallow thing, haunted by the faces of the crowd and the unnerving quiet of her new captor. She resolved to work, to earn her keep, to make herself useful, for in usefulness, perhaps, lay a sliver of safety. Days bled into weeks on Silas's isolated ranch, each one a careful, silent dance of coexistence. Ilara rose before dawn, the chill air a sharp reminder of her precarious situation. She found tasks for herself, sweeping the cabin floor with a worn broom, hauling water from the creek, mending the threadbare curtains that offered little privacy to her alcove. She discovered a small, neglected vegetable patch behind the cabin, choked with weeds. With a rusty hoe she found in the barn, she began to clear it, her hands, already calloused, soon raw and aching. She worked tirelessly, driven by a desperate need to prove her worth, to preempt any displeasure from the silent man who was now her keeper. Silas observed her efforts with his usual inscrutable expression. He never praised, never criticized. He simply went about his own demanding chores, tending his few cattle, mending fences, chopping firewood. His limp was more pronounced after a long day's labor, but he never complained. He would leave a piece of jerky or a biscuit on the edge of the patch while she worked, then retreat without a word. One morning, Ilara found a small, roughly carved wooden bird on the crate beside her cot. Its lines were simple, almost crude, yet there was a certain grace to its unpainted form. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the whittle marks. It was the first gift, however small, she had received in longer than she could remember that wasn't a prelude to pain. She said nothing, showed no sign she'd seen it, but she tucked it carefully beneath her thin pillow. A few days later, she noticed Silas's favorite work shirt, patched many times over, had a fresh tear along the shoulder seam. That evening, after he'd gone to check on the cattle, she took it from the peg where it hung, and with a needle and thread salvaged from her old dress, she meticulously mended it, her stitches small and even. She hung it back before he returned. He wore it the next day without comment, but she thought she saw his gaze linger for a fraction of a second on the neat repair. The silence between them remained vast, yet pinpricks of understanding were beginning to pierce the darkness. He started leaving a bucket of fresh water near the garden for her. She, in turn, began to leave a tin cup of cool creek water on a fence post near where he was working under the hot sun. Once, a sudden downpour caught them both far from the cabin. He wordlessly shrugged off his heavy, oiled coat and draped it over her shoulders before striding on toward shelter, leaving her to follow, warmed more by the unexpected gesture than the coat itself. Her fear hadn't vanished, but it had shifted, morphing into a weary vigilance, a cautious curiosity about this man who treated her not as property, but as something else. Something he hadn't yet defined, and neither had she. She began to notice the subtle rhythms of the land, the way the light changed, the distinct calls of the birds. One afternoon, a young calf got itself tangled in a thicket. Silas fought to free it, his frustration growing. Ilara, watching from a distance, felt a strange pull. She approached slowly, humming a low, wordless tune, something she hadn't realized she remembered. The calf, wild-eyed and struggling, stilled. Its ears twitched. Silas paused, surprised. Ilara continued to hum, her hand outstretched, and the calf, miraculously, allowed her to gently untangle its leg. Silas said nothing, but his gaze, when it met hers, held a new, thoughtful quality. The wildness they accused her of, perhaps it was just a language the world had forgotten how to hear. The harsh edges of their initial arrangement began to soften, imperceptibly at first, like river stones worn smooth by the relentless current of shared days. The silence in the small cabin was no longer solely a void of fear and uncertainty. Sometimes, it felt like a shared space, a quiet understanding that needed no words. Ilara found herself watching Silas more often, not with apprehension, but with a dawning recognition of the deep loneliness that clung to him like the scent of wood smoke. She saw the way his shoulders sagged when he thought no one was looking, the flicker of old pain in his eyes when he stared too long into the fire. One evening, the air hung heavy and still, the kind of quiet that precedes a storm. They sat outside the cabin, the day's work done, watching the stars begin to prick the darkening velvet of the sky. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. Silas had been whittling, his calloused hand surprisingly deft with the small piece of wood. He paused, his knife still, his gaze fixed on the glowing embers of the small fire he'd built. "The war," he said, his voice low, raspy, as if dredging the words from a deep, forgotten well. "It changes a man. Takes things you can't get back." Ilara waited, her breath caught in her throat. He hadn't spoken more than a few necessary words to her in all the weeks she'd been there. He ran a hand over his bad leg. "Lost my brother at Shiloh. My folks, fever took him while I was away fighting for a cause I ain't sure I understood even then. Came back to nothing. Just ghosts and land nobody wanted. He picked up a twig, snapping it between his fingers. Figured out here, a man could be alone with his ghosts without troubling anyone else. Elara listened, her own carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. She recognized the cadence of loss in his voice, the weight of unspoken grief. The vast, empty spaces of the frontier suddenly felt less like a threat and more like a sanctuary for souls too bruised for the crowded world. After a long silence, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper, fragile as a moth's wing. They called me cursed child back in the orphanage. Said I brought ill luck. She traced a pattern in the dust with her finger. My mother, she left me on their steps. Never knew my father. She hesitated, then continued, the words tumbling out as if a dam had broken. I ran away more times than I can count. Each place, each man, they wanted something different. Some wanted a servant. Some wanted other things. Her voice caught, but she pressed on. They said I was wild because I wouldn't break. Because I saw things sometimes, felt things. Like the weather changing, or when someone was lying. She clutched the small, smooth stone she always kept hidden in her pocket, a memento of a kinder hand, long ago. It scared them. So they called it madness. Or a curse. Silas looked at her then, truly looked, and for the first time, she saw not a captor, nor a master, but simply a man who understood the language of pain. The stars above seemed to lean closer, witnesses to the fragile tendrils of trust unfurling in the quiet desolation. The fragile peace they had begun to build was shattered with the fury of a mountain storm. It came on suddenly, a black wall of cloud rolling over the peaks, swallowing the late autumn sun. The wind shrieked like a banshee, tearing at the cabin, and the rain turned to sleet, then to a blinding blizzard, trapping them in a world of swirling white. They had been caught unprepared. The winter supplies were not yet fully laid in. Silas had been out checking a section of fence line miles from the cabin when the storm hit with its full ferocity. Elara, watching the sky darken with an unnerving speed, had felt a prickle of her old, familiar dread. Her intuition screamed danger. She secured the cabin as best she could, her anxiety mounting with every passing hour. Silas did not return. Night fell, and the storm only intensified. The cabin groaned under the weight of the wind and snow. Finally, near midnight, the door burst open, and Silas stumbled in, half frozen, covered in snow, dragging his injured leg. He collapsed onto the floor, his face pale and drawn. He'd been thrown from his horse when a tree branch, heavy with ice, had snapped and fallen. His old war wound, the one in his leg, was clearly aggravated, and a fever was already beginning to burn in his eyes. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Elara. But with it came a surge of something else, a fierce, protective resolve. This man, who had shown her the first flicker of kindness she had known in years, was hurt, and she was the only one there. Her initial impulse to flee, a deeply ingrained survival instinct, was overridden by a stronger, newer imperative. Silas was drifting in and out of consciousness, muttering incoherently. His leg was swollen and hot to the touch. Elara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that if the fever wasn't broken, he might not survive. Drawing on a forgotten well of knowledge, scraps of herbal lore learned from an old woman in one of the many places she'd briefly stayed, she knew what she had to do. Bundling herself in every spare piece of cloth she could find, she braved the raging blizzard. The wind tore at her, the snow blinded her, but she pushed on, her mind fixed on the image of willow bark and feverfew, plants she'd seen growing near the creek. Her intuition, that curse others had feared, guided her through the white chaos. Hours later, she stumbled back into the cabin, numb with cold but clutching a precious handful of herbs. She brewed a potent tea, forcing the bitter liquid past Silas's clenched teeth. She bathed his feverish brow, changed his sodden clothes, and kept the fire roaring, her determination a shield against the storm's fury and her own exhaustion. For 2 days and nights, she fought for his life, tending to him with a fierce tenderness, her own needs forgotten. She kept the livestock in the barn fed and watered, venturing out into the relentless storm, her small frame battling the elements. In his moments of lucidity, Silas would watch her, his fever-bright eyes filled with a dazed wonder. He saw not the wild girl of Redemption Gulch, but a woman of incredible strength and compassion, a guardian angel conjured from the heart of the storm. He saw her resilience, her unwavering spirit, and knew, with a clarity that cut through the fever haze, that she was saving more than just his life. The blizzard eventually blew itself out, leaving behind a world transformed, draped in a pristine, silent blanket of white. The sun emerged, dazzling on the snow-covered landscape. Inside the small cabin, the immediate crisis had passed. Silas's fever had broken, the potent herbs and Ilara's tireless care having pulled him back from the brink. He was weak, his legs still pained him fiercely, but the light of awareness had returned to his eyes. He watched Ilara as she moved quietly about the cabin, tidying, preparing a thin broth. A profound gratitude, deeper than words, filled him. He had been a lone wolf for so long, convinced he needed no one, yet this woman, this outcast, had tethered him to life. Just as a fragile sense of hope began to settle between them, a new threat appeared on the horizon, dark against the snow. A group of riders, led by none other than Jedediah Thorn, their forms menacing in the stark winter light. Thorn, having heard whispers in Redemption Gulch of Silas's isolation and perhaps, through some cruel informant, of his recent incapacitation, had come to reclaim what he still considered his property, or at least to extort a hefty sum. Blackwood! Thorn's voice boomed across the snowy clearing, arrogant and cruel. Heard you had a bit of weather. Come out. We've come to discuss the girl. Seems you got more than you bargained for, and I'm prepared to take her off your hands, for a price, of course. Or perhaps she just wandered back to her rightful owner. Silas, leaning heavily on a makeshift crutch Ilara had fashioned, pulled himself to his feet. His face was grim. The old reluctance to engage, to resort to the violence he knew so well, warred with a new, powerful instinct to protect what was now his. And Ilara, standing beside him, was undeniably his to protect, not as property, but as a cherished part of the life they were forging. She's not for sale, Thorn, Silas said, his voice quiet but firm as the frozen earth beneath them. And she's not yours. Ilara did not cower. She stood beside Silas, her small hand resting lightly on his arm, a silent statement of allegiance. The fear was there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a fierce loyalty. When one of Thorn's men subtly tried to circle around the cabin, perhaps seeking a vulnerable point, Ilara's eyes, sharp and intuitive, caught the movement. Silas, to your left, she cried, her voice clear and strong, cutting through the tense air. Her warning came just in time for Silas to sidestep a poorly aimed shot from the man, who had hoped to take him by surprise. Thorn laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. Still got spirit, has she? Maybe Blackwood here has tamed her after all. Or maybe, he sneered, he just likes phlegm. Wild the taunt was meant to provoke, to demean. But Silas felt a surge of cold anger. This wasn't just about Ilara anymore, it was about the sanctuary they had built, the fragile hope that had taken root in this desolate place. He would not let Thorn trample it. The confrontation was inevitable, a brutal clash of wills under the cold winter sun, a fight for more than just survival, but for the right to choose their own destiny. The air crackled with unspoken violence. Thorn, emboldened by Silas's visible weakness and the presence of his two thuggish companions, dismounted, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. Now, Blackwood, don't be foolish. You're in no shape to play hero. Just give us the girl, and we'll be on our way. Save yourself further pain. Silas gripped his crutch tighter, his knuckles white. The thought of Ilara back in Thorn's clutches, her spirit slowly crushed, was unbearable. He remembered the ghosts of those he couldn't save, and a steely resolve hardened his gaze. You'll leave, Silas stated, his voice dangerously low. Now. And you won't come back. Thorn chuckled. Brave words for a cripple. He gestured to his men. Take her. As the men advanced, Silas moved with surprising speed for someone injured, positioning himself squarely between them and Ilara. He swung his crutch like a club, connecting solidly with the first man's ribs, sending him sprawling into the snow with a grunt of pain. The second man, more cautious, drew a rusty knife, his eyes glinting. Ilara, however, was not idle. As the second man lunged toward Silas's exposed side, she let out a piercing, high-pitched shriek, a sound so unexpected, so primal, that it startled not only Thorn's man but also his horse, which reared in alarm, adding to the chaos. The momentary distraction was all Silas needed. He parried the knife thrust with his crutch, the wood splintering, and used his good leg to deliver a powerful kick to the man's knee. The man howled and collapsed. Thorn, enraged, drew a pistol. "You stubborn fool, Blackwood! She ain't worth dying for." But before Thorn could aim, Ilara, quick as a deer, scooped up a handful of icy snow and flung it directly into his face. Blinded and sputtering, Thorn fired wildly, the shot going harmlessly into the sky. Silas lunged, ignoring the searing pain in his leg, and tackled Thorn to the ground. The fight was desperate, brutal, and short. Silas, fueled by a protective fury he hadn't felt in years, subdued Thorn, his hands like iron bands. The other two men, seeing their leader defeated and nursing their own injuries, showed no inclination to continue the fight. Silas, breathing heavily, hauled Thorn to his feet. "Get out of here, Thorn," he growled, his face inches from the terrified bully. "If I ever see you near this valley, near her, again, you won't walk away." She shoved Thorn towards his horse. The defeated men mounted, Thorn casting one last hateful glare at Ilara and Silas before they rode away, their retreat ignominious in the silent, watching snow. Silas sagged against the cabin wall, the adrenaline ebbing, leaving him trembling with exhaustion and pain. Ilara rushed to his side, her face pale but her eyes shining with a fierce light. He looked at her, at this woman who had faced down her tormentor, who had fought beside him. The last vestiges of the wild girl label, the cursed child, evaporated in the clear, cold air. In their place stood Ilara, strong, brave, and undeniably his partner. He reached out, his calloused hand gently touching her cheek. "You all right?" he rasped. She nodded, a watery smile gracing her lips. "We are," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. In the aftermath of the confrontation, a profound quiet settled over the small ranch, broken only by the drip of melting snow from the eaves and the soft murmur of their voices. The threat had been neutralized, the ghosts of Ilara's past, at least in the form of Jedediah Thorn, banished. They stood together in the doorway of the cabin, the winter sun casting long shadows, surveying the trampled snow, the signs of the brief, violent struggle. But what they truly saw was the resilience of their bond, forged in shared hardship and now tempered in conflict. Silas turned to Ilara, his gaze earnest, stripping away all his usual reticence. The fever and the fight had burned away his defenses, leaving only the raw truth of his feelings. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden meadowlark, its head tilted as if in song. He had worked on it during the long, lonely nights before Ilara's arrival, and finished it in the quiet moments watching her heal, watching her bring life back to his forgotten corners. He pressed it into her hand. I made this," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "It ain't much." He looked deep into her eyes, the winter sky blue of his own reflecting a warmth she had never expected to find. "This ain't about keeping you, Ilara. Not like Thorn, not like any of them." He took a deep breath. "This is about choosing you. Every day. If you want to stay, if you choose to. This place, this life, it's yours too, now. As much as it's mine." He didn't offer grand pronouncements of love, no flowery speeches. His words were simple, direct, rooted in the solid truth of his heart, much like the man himself. He held out his hand, not to claim, but to offer, to invite. Ilara looked at the delicate bird in her palm, its smooth wood warm against her skin. Tears welled in her eyes, not tears of sorrow or fear, but of a profound, overwhelming relief, of a belonging she had never dared to dream of. She had been bought, sold, labeled, and discarded. But Silas? Silas chose her. She slowly placed her hand in his, her smaller one fitting perfectly within his strong, calloused grip. "I choose it, Silas," she whispered, her voice trembling but clear. "I choose you." A faint smile, the first truly radiant smile he had ever seen from her, illuminated her face, chasing away the last shadows of her haunted past. The wild, broken girl had found her sanctuary, not in being tamed, but in being truly seen, and unequivocally chosen. Spring arrived at Havenwood Ranch, for so they had tacitly begun to call it, not with a sudden burst, but with a gentle unfurling, like a whispered promise. the snows melted, feeding the eager creek, and the valley floor transformed into a carpet of wildflowers, blues, yellows, and fiery reds, many of them seeded from the small, carefully tended patch Elara had coaxed into life beside the cabin. The cabin itself seemed to breathe easier, mended and cared for, with bright, simple curtains Elara had sewn now framing the windows, and the scent of baking bread often mingling with the aroma of pine and damp earth. A year, then two, slipped by, measured not in hardship, but in shared sunrises, the quiet rhythm of work, and the growing warmth of companionship. Elara was no longer the haunted, silent girl who had arrived in Redemption Gulch. The lines of fear had softened around her eyes, replaced by a clear, knowing light. Her laughter, once a rare and precious sound, now echoed freely in the valley as she worked alongside Silas, her intuitive connection to the land and its creatures a source of constant wonder. She had a way with the animals, even the most skittish colt would gentle under her touch, and the chicken seemed to lay more eggs when she was near. Her knowledge of herbs, once a hidden secret, became a blessing. When a fever swept through the nearby, scattered homesteads, it was Elara's remedies, delivered with a quiet confidence, that brought relief to many. Silas, too, was a changed man. The deep furrows of loneliness on his brow had eased. The gruff exterior remained, but it was now weathered by a quiet contentment rather than bitterness. His limp was a part of him, a reminder of past battles, but it no longer defined him. He moved with a purpose that came from having something precious to protect and nurture. He'd even taken to whittling small figures for the children of the few families who now dared to visit Havenwood, his silent way of sharing the peace he'd found. The community of Redemption Gulch, once so quick to judge and condemn, had slowly, grudgingly, begun to alter its perception of Silas Blackwood's wild girl. The stories of her courage during the blizzard, of her healing touch, of her uncanny ability to predict sudden storms or find lost livestock, circulated through the town. The initial fear and suspicion gave way to curiosity, then to a grudging respect, and finally, for some, to genuine admiration. They no longer whispered of her being cursed or untouched, instead, they spoke of her being gifted, wise, or a true frontier woman. When the bridge over Swift Creek washed out, isolating several families, it was Elara's knowledge of an old, forgotten high trail that allowed supplies to get through. She didn't seek their approval, but it came nonetheless, a quiet acknowledgement of her intrinsic worth. Silas and Elara, the broken rancher and the outcast girl, had not just healed each other, they had created a sanctuary, a testament to the enduring power of kindness and acceptance. Their love story, unspoken in grand declarations but lived in every shared glance, every helping hand, became a quiet legend in the valley, a reminder that even the most damaged souls could find their way home, and that sometimes, the wildest hearts held the greatest capacity for love. The ranch, once a symbol of Silas's isolation, was now a beacon of shared strength and gentle prosperity, a true haven. This tale of Silas and Elara, of a love that blossomed in the unlikeliest of soils, reminds us that the harshest beginnings do not always dictate the final chapter. It speaks to the quiet courage it takes to see beyond the labels society imposes, to recognize the intrinsic worth hidden beneath layers of pain and misunderstanding. Their journey from public despair to private salvation, from the dust of Redemption Gulch to the blooming fields of Havenwood, is a testament to the transformative power of compassion and the profound healing that occurs when one soul truly chooses another, not to possess, but to shelter and uplift. Silas, the stoic protector haunted by his past, found his own redemption not in forgetting his wounds, but in allowing them to be soothed by Elara's resilient spirit. And Elara, the resilient outcast branded as too wild, found her voice, her agency, and her belonging not by being tamed, but by being cherished for the very wildness that was her untamed strength, her intuitive wisdom, her unbreakable core. Their story echoes the timeless truth that love is not about finding a perfect person, but about seeing an imperfect person perfectly, about building a sanctuary where two incomplete halves can become a stronger, more beautiful whole. It teaches us that what the world hastily deems broken can often be mended with unwavering patience, and that qualities labeled wild might simply be strengths the world is not yet wise enough to comprehend. We see how a community, initially a chorus of judgment, can evolve, its perception shifted by the undeniable evidence of goodness and resilience. Havenwood Ranch stands as a symbol not just of their love, but of the potential for any barren ground to flourish when tended with care and watered with genuine affection. It reminds us that every soul, no matter how weathered by the storms of life, carries within it the seeds of hope, waiting for the right conditions to bloom. The quiet haven they built, brick by painstaking brick of trust and shared experience, shows that true strength isn't about the absence of scars, but the courage to build a future despite them. Their legacy is not one of dramatic pronouncements, but of the profound impact of small, consistent acts of kindness, the silent language of loyal hearts. If the journey of Silas and Ilara, their quiet triumph over adversity and their profound discovery of love in a desolate land, has resonated with you, if their story of healing and mutual redemption has touched your spirit, we invite you to help share this message of hope. Please take a moment to like this video, to share its light with others who might find solace or inspiration in its telling, and consider subscribing to our channel for more stories that explore the depths of human connection and the enduring strength found in choosing love against all odds. Until we meet again, may you always have the courage to look beyond the surface, the wisdom to cherish the wildness within, and the grace to offer a haven to a deserving heart.